Okay, welcome to this lecture, Architecture and Ideology, the second in the series of lectures on architecture and ideology, this one covering the theme of National Socialism. This is a lecture for GGM 225 Cultural Geography at the University of Birmingham. If you have any information about copyright images in this presentation, please get in touch with me directly and I will ensure they're taken down. What are we doing today? Well, we have a little introduction. We want to talk a little bit about the classical origins of architecture before we actually move into the specifics of talking about National Socialist architecture by looking at Albert Speer and his relationship with Adolf Hitler, and then thinking about the way that Speer in particular thought about architecture for theatrical purposes, particularly looking at the parade ground site at Nuremberg. We'll then turn to Munich and look at the Königsplatz development, before moving on to Berlin, looking at the actual and fantasy developments which are planned for that city. And then finally we'll look at the legacy of National Socialist architecture in Germany. So by way of introduction, this is some new material put into this lecture for this year. Part of this reaction to Berlin Field Course last year, where I was quite horrified to find out that a number of people, particularly boys, on the trip, were thinking that the Holocaust was a subject for comedy, that it was somehow funny, and this upset me and annoyed me a great deal. So I thought I should start really with just a little reminder about what happened under the National Socialist regime. Most of this lecture is about glamour, but let's look at the rather nasty reality that underpinned that glamour to start with. That at the outbreak of war, prior to the start of the Holocaust, there were about 9 million Jews who lived in Europe, and about 6 million of them were killed. Let's just say that again, 6 million out of 9 million killed. That includes 1 million children. That's just the Jews. We don't know how many people of Romani ethnic origins were killed. Estimates range somewhere between 100,000 and 1.5 million. We simply don't know. Similarly, we don't know how many Russian Slavs were killed. Again, somewhere between 11 million and 20 million. This is a lot of people being brutally murdered by the state. And you get images like this, which are particularly shocking, with shoes piled up in the concentration camps taken from the bodies of people who've been murdered. But a more arresting image from my point of view is this one. This is a collection of camp guards. This is a photo which is available in the Topography of Terror exhibition in Berlin. I find this particularly shocking because here are some people who work hard every day murdering people, or helping in the murder of people, and it's a tough job. And they've got some time off, and they're going to pose for a photograph, and they're going to listen to some music, and they're going to have a jolly good time because they deserve a break from the hard but important work they're doing, brutally murdering people that they consider to be a threat to the National Socialist state. This image chills me more than any image of piles of shoes, because this is the image which says, we believe in what we are doing. So the lesson of all this is not to be seduced. The Nazis used a variety of techniques to try to redefine evil acts as being good acts, because one can very easily persuade people to do evil things if you tell them that what they're doing is for good. Most people are fundamentally good people, so you need to make people believe fervently that they are doing good by ridding the world of degenerates, or at the very least that they'll be too scared to say anything when other people are trying to get rid of the degenerates. So this idea of trying to redefine evil acts as being good and important acts was manifested through a number of different ways. It was action through a number of ways. Cinema, pageantry, popular entertainment, the uniforms, the speeches, the rallies, and also the architecture. So if we think of this as a performance of ideology, if we think back to the previous lecture, modernist architecture was fundamentally socialist in its inspiration. We had things like the Neue Sachlichkeit, the existence minimum, which demonstrated a really pragmatic attempt to make the world a better place by providing people with good quality accommodation. It was very practical and pragmatic and unshowy. Nazi architecture, conversely, was about spectacle, it was about theatre, it was about demonstration of German superiority. In this sense, form was the function. It looked spectacular because you wanted to get people bought into this mythos of what Germany was about. And that mythos is about the regime, the National Socialist regime, being inevitable, being glorious, being good, and that as a citizen you are part of this absolutely amazing set of things. We need to go back a step, however, and think a little bit about the classical origins of architecture and some of the design language which is subsequently drawn upon. So we start with the Doric order of columns. This was a system of architecture, origins around about the 7th century BC, and it's very plain. You see the column elements, quite short, fat, with a very plain capital. That's the thing on the top, over which you have beams sitting. So this is an initial start of these elements in classical architecture. We see Doric order, and we can see how it fits into a wider set of other architectural features: cornice, a frieze, an architrave, to make up a system of architecture, a system of design. And you see these systems, elements of it repeated endlessly. So if we look at something like the Acropolis, which is one of the most full manifestations of the Doric order in architecture, we can see the elements that repeat in all kinds of buildings subsequently. We see these motifs repeating again and again. But the Doric is only one of the types of columns that we see in classical architecture, or the types of orders, as they're technically called. The Ionic is another order of columns associated with 6th century BC Ionia, much more slender columns, taller and thinner, with an eye-shaped capital. This is how it's easy to remember, I for Ionic. Then finally, of the major orders, there are some minor orders which we won't go into, but of the major orders we have the Corinthian. Again, tall, slender columns. This time the capitals on the top are much more decorative, usually designed with a pattern of acanthus leaves, much more frilly and fancy. We also see the deep carved flutes within the column shaft itself. The arch is more closely associated with the Romans rather than the Greeks. It wasn't invented by the Romans, but it was a key element of their architecture. Essentially, it's a solution to a problem of building in stone. When you build with columns and beams, you have to have the columns quite narrowly spaced, because a beam made out of stone can only span a certain width before it cracks, because stone is very strong when compressed, but very comparatively weak when it's subjected to torsion forces. So it can't span long gaps, but it can withstand a great deal of crushing forces. So if you create an arch which transmits the forces downward through compression, you can span much longer gaps. And therefore you can create more daring architecture, such as the triumphal arch and the viaduct, classic uses. So here's a sort of classic Roman aqueduct. Again, you see the arch forms being able to give much greater spans of distance. You also see it in things like the Colosseum here in Rome. This was regarded as a bit of a bastardized architecture. You see the different columns, the three orders of columns, holding up the different levels with the arches. It's not an unproblematic design. In this case, the columns are not holding up the weight of the building, they're merely decorative. And we would normally refer to columns which don't bear weight as pilasters rather than pillars. But this kind of use of the arch as an architectural motif, we see it in the triumphal arch, in this case the Arch of Titus, built around about 2 AD to celebrate the sacking of Jerusalem in 30 AD. It uses Corinthian and Ionic order pilasters, not columns because they're not weight bearing. The weight is borne by the arch. A final key element is the use of domes or vaulting, working on similar principles to the arch of transmitting the weight of the building outward and downward in compression rather than tension. And we have the influence of the Pantheon commissioned by the Emperor Hadrian in 126 AD in Rome, essentially to demonstrate the power of the regime. Look at what we can do, is what this building says. It also has a coffered ceiling with these sunken panels. So this is the Pantheon from the outside. Again, you see the temple frontage with the Corinthian columns, but at the back we have this vaulted dome, which in a very architecturally flashy move, they've left the dome open at the top so the sunlight can penetrate through. You can also see the square pieces cut out of the ceiling, this coffered effect, which really signals its architectural delicacy. But remember this number, it's 43.3 metres across. Remember that. That's going to be significant later on. That's a heck of a large open span, particularly when you consider when this was built. Now if we fast forward, classical motifs continue to appear in all sorts of designs during the redevelopment of cities in a number of periods. So here we have an early 19th century example in the Edinburgh New Town. As Edinburgh New Town was being built, we can see the references to the classical elements here. The lower stories of the buildings are what we call rusticated, which is where the joins between the stones are highlighted by deep cuts. You see a very good example of this in Birmingham's own town hall. You see the rusticated lower story with the exaggerated sense of the stones on the lower stories, and then above we have a classic temple architecture with Corinthian columns. Built by Joseph Hansom around about 1834. Joseph Hansom, more famous for designing the Hansom cab. Again, look at the detail of the rusticated lower story. You can see how the gaps between the stones have been highlighted by cuts, and in this particular case, and this was quite common, the surface of the stone itself is then made rough to give an interesting texture to the development. A more simplified, stripped-down neoclassical design can be seen in things like the Federal Reserve building designed by Paul Crater around about 1935. And we see the elements here are present. We can see the columns or echoes of columns in the windows either side of the main portico. But it's much simpler than a classic design. It's a stripped-down version of classicism. And this was not an uncommon style of building, as we're going to see. We're moving back now to consider the origins of National Socialist architectural style, particularly with Albert Speer and Adolf Hitler himself. These two individuals had an enduring relationship. Mein Kampf, Hitler's early autobiography, says that he was at an early stage convinced he should be an architect, and some of the sketches that he made in the 1920s actually were the inspiration for a number of later designs by Speer and others. Now Speer himself, as a young man, joined the Nazi Party in 1931. He'd heard Hitler speak, he was inspired, and having joined the Nazi Party as a fairly unsuccessful architect, he started to get commissions from the party. So, for example, in 1932, interior of the Berlin headquarters. And very quickly Speer becomes the key architect for the National Socialist regime. Albert Speer designed the parade grounds at Nuremberg, or elements of the parade grounds, in 1933, and Hitler really liked these designs for the combination of neoclassical, so there's connection to a long history of classical work, but also the theatricality, in whether to use flags and lighting to create a stage set. And a close personal friendship developed between the two men. Hitler's a little older than Speer. But when Paul Truce died in 1934, Speer became the regime's architect-in-chief, and he shaped German design up to 1939 and plans for German design thereafter. This is perhaps his most famous building, and it's a non-building. It's the Lichtdom, the Cathedral of Light. This was part of the party rally grounds at Nuremberg. And we see the building in the front, but around the building and indeed around the whole field where the parades were happening, we see a whole variety of spotlights that create a cage of light around the parade grounds. So if you are in the parade grounds, you're inside this cathedral of light. So it's a non-building, it's an illusion. It was his favourite building, and as Barbara Miller Lane, the famous art historian, said, Speer's talent was above all a theatrical talent, and it was that which most fundamentally endeared him to Hitler, who regarded architecture as a stage setting and instant propaganda. This is what Speer was about. He was about creating theatre for the regime to convince people of the grandeur of the regime. In the lecture there will be a number of short videos. These can all be found on YouTube if you want to go and have a look at them. The theory of ruin value is something that Speer developed with his work, partly by saying, when you go to ancient Rome, when you go to Rome and you look at the ruins of the ancient past, you are impressed. Even if you don't actually know the emperors who commissioned it, you would be impressed by seeing the ruins of those buildings. And in Speer's autobiography, lots of self-justifying nonsense, he says that Hitler was fixated on architecture as a future legacy, as a way of ensuring his legacy would carry on. And this idea of saying, well, the buildings that we build should become beautiful ruins in 3,000 years' time. Now the problem with that was, all very well to have this theory of just what beautiful ruins we will make in the future, but a lot of Speer's buildings were using reinforced concrete, a very modern material, with just a skin of stone over the top, so they were never going to ruin particularly well. They were just going to decay and fall apart. But let's consider some of the most important buildings that Speer and his team put together by looking at Nuremberg as architecture theatre. Nuremberg was the site of major National Socialist Party rallies. It was used in the 1920s, and then in 1933 it became the permanent home for the main party rallies. And this is not a kind of gathering to discuss policy in the way that a British political rally might be. These rallies were definitely set up as being a celebration of the regime, a demonstration of power, and an opportunity to get people really enthused and evangelical about the regime, and as such functioned almost as quasi-religious events. You were there to worship the party elders, you were there to feel part of a mystical and magical regime. And you can see this if you watch elements of Triumph of the Will by Leni Riefenstahl. She made this documentary of the 1934 Nuremberg rally and took the 8-day event and sort of compressed it down into sort of 4 virtual days of cinema. And if you watch the film, well, there's a lot of marching, there's a lot of things of traditional costume residents and workers who are drilling with spades. We have the Hitler Youth, you have the SA and the SS men. But all of this stuff takes place within a stage set, a framing which is made by architecture. And architecture is there very much to be a part of the celebration of the regime. Nuremberg itself was rather an odd choice for these party rallies. It was a left-wing stronghold, but it had connections to the Holy Roman Empire. It was an imperial seat in the Middle Ages, so it connected the history of the National Socialist regime to a history of German imperialism in the past. Nuremberg was also a sort of Romantic era centre for art and culture, so it was very much seen as German, a good place to do things that buy you into the mythos of this being an inevitable part of German culture. And you see this in a kind of medievalization process of the city core, as in terms of setting Nuremberg as a stage set, you have attempts to make it look more medieval, more Germanic, so you have things exposing the original timber frames of buildings, with big windows replaced with small windows. They used arches to cover up modern shop fronts, and indeed, in one case, destroyed a synagogue in order to not spoil the Germanic nature of this stage set for the party rally. Here's a map of the different elements of the main party rally ground. You can see to the north the Lichtdom Arena, which we'll come back to in a minute, and then on the southern side, number 8 on this map is Marsfeld, which was going to be another enormous rally ground. Number 11 is the Zeppelin Field, which is where we saw the Cathedral of Light earlier. So this is the Lichtdom Arena, and you have a thing which is called the Haupttribüne. Basically, this was the pulpit. Pulvinar is a word about giving a position from which to preach. It's a classical architectural motif, and this is the point where Hitler could preach to his assembled masses. You see the troops and others lined up to receive his word. You also see in the background another building, which we will see again in a moment, which was a war memorial. And if you watch Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, that war memorial becomes a sort of central motif, a sort of high point of the emotions of that movie. A memorial to the martyrs of the First World War. And again, this is a way of connecting the tragedy and losses of the First World War with the glorious new regime of the National Socialists. Again, a way of giving the regime legitimacy. You don't really get a good sense from the black and white photos, or indeed Riefenstahl's film, about just how beautiful all of this looked. We have particular cultural associations now with the brown uniforms and the red, white and black flags. But when you consider these in the context of the dazzling white limestone, this is quite a visual spectacle that people are part of. You shouldn't underestimate that, again, as being part of this sense of the importance of the individual being part of this regime, you're part of something glorious and wonderful. And you march past various buildings, this is again back to the Zeppelin Field, and you receive the blessing of Adolf Hitler. Now, that building on the Zeppelin Field, the Haupttribüne, was 390 metres long. That's a truly massive building. Very little of it still remains, we'll see later on. But it becomes a place of blessing, of praising the glories of the regime as embodied by the person of Adolf Hitler. And when Speer designed the Haupttribüne, he was very inspired by some existing archaeological findings going on classical antiquity. In particular, the Pergamon Altar. Now, this photograph doesn't really give any justice to the scale of this thing. This is quite a large structure that you could actually walk through. It was recovered by German archaeologists at the start of the 20th century. And you get a sense of the power of the classical regime that they were trying to emulate. So this altarpiece was only 35 metres across rather than 390 metres across. So Speer took these classical elements and blew them up to ridiculous proportions. And if you go online, you can see the Pulvinar, the place of preaching that was on the Zeppelin Field tribute. And you can always find interesting pictures of people going in, having a photograph taken with a Hitler stud and so on, and sometimes doing Nazi salutes in an entirely non-hilarious way. As Scobie said of the Pulvinar, here Hitler presented himself to his Volk as leader and living symbol of the German Reich. Flags, searchlights, stirring music and rituals such as the blessing of standards all help to engage the emotions of the massed spectators. When you're in that space, you see yourself as being part of this glorious regime, and the glory of it is embodied in the person of Hitler. He's the person that you go and you worship past. The idea of all this is to try to create a sensory overload. This is something that Hitler was very well adept at in Mein Kampf. He understood the effectiveness of twilight candles and so forth on the power of the Catholic Church and the mysticism of the Church. And so what you have at places like Nuremberg is this idea of dazzling limestone, the blood red flag, the torchlit procession, the searchlights and so on, All of this is deliberate. It's about using architecture to frame a mystic ritual. This is about getting people bought into mysticism of the regime, to support the regime because it is inevitable, because it is glorious, because it is good. How could it not be good? Look at this magnificent show that it's putting on. Scale is an issue in all of these things. It's sometimes difficult to really get a handle on how big some of these spaces are. So this is the Great Road, the Königsplatz, which was built to link up various parts of the site. Now, when I say things like it's 60 metres wide as a parade route, 60 metres is an abstract sort of scale. So here's a contemporary Google Earth shot of the site. You can see running through the centre of the Great Road. There it is. And if we zoom in on that Google Earth shot, you can see a car parked on the Great Road, this 60 metre wide road, and that suddenly gives you a sense of just how big this space was. This is all paved in granite. It's designed for marching, the click, 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 click of heels going up and down. This is a scary space. There were other elements in that space as well. We have the Congress Hall, which started to be built from around about 1935, and it's a very beautiful, again, classical building in many ways. You can see the arch elements, you can see the pilasters running up the side of the building. It has echoes in a strict, simplified way of the Colosseum in Rome, but it's not the Colosseum in Rome. It was intended to be roofed over. Now, it's unlikely that the technology available at the time would have allowed it to have been roofed over in this way. So this great Congress Hall, which is supposed to be laid out in this sort of fashion, is in fact empty on the inside. You can see the bare brick waiting to have the architectural elements hung off it if the building was ever completed, but they never managed to roof it over, they never managed to finish it before the war broke out. So it remains today a great big open space, with not a lot in it. Again, the cars and trucks give you some idea of scale within this space. There was also a plan to put the Olympic Stadium on this site. Drawing on the classical design of Herodus Atticus in Athens, around about 161 AD, this horseshoe-shaped stadium, Atticus designed the Deutsches Stadion, which was to be the home of the Olympic Games from the end of the Second World War onward, when Germany was victorious, so that each 4 years people would come from all across the world to the Deutsches Stadion to be humiliated by the great German Athens. So this permanent home for the Olympics, you can see the scale of it on the site here, whereas the Athenian model on which it was based was actually set in a bow on the ground. Speer's design would have called for a huge barrel vaulting to be built and express elevators to carry people up into the stands. This was a massive, massive project. And you can see from contemporary air photographs, this is around about 1943, that some of the clearance sites on this area have been started. So you can see the cleared ground where the stadium was going to be built. You can see the sites of further development, which had originally been the campsite for people at the Rallies, but during the Second World War became a POW camp where they were employed in forced labour to actually start doing the ground clearing to build these giant follies. But of course they never happened, and the site which was cleared to build the stadium is now partly submerged in a lake. Let's move away from Nuremberg now to Munich and look at the Königsplatz, the King's Square. Prior to the National Socialist redesign, this square had 3 classical buildings, one to each side, and then an open end to it. And so the notion was to complete the square by building some new buildings, again in a classical idiom. But you can also see that the grass of the square was replaced with a paved area. there's a conventional narrative about the transformation of this square. That conventional narrative is that the Führer had a vision, and that Paul Troost designs some rather unsurprising, unremarkable neoclassical buildings that wouldn't have looked out of place, frankly, in Washington, D.C. They look very much like the kind of buildings that Kraft was building in D.C. But these unsurprising designs form party offices and the Führerbau, the Führer's personal office, for renting this down from Munich and Berlin. But in addition to those not particularly remarkable classical buildings, there was a small pair of temples which sat either side of a road. You can see those temples in this slide, open to the sky, sitting either side of those twin, unremarkable neoclassical buildings. Now, early in 1934 they were on the plans as the Halls of Honour, but it was never really clear what their function was. And then later on in 1934 they were renamed the Temples of Honour, and they were slightly redesigned to house the sarcophagi of the 16 Nazis who killed in Putsch in 1923. So rather than these being an example of the Führer's vision being carried out, people weren't quite sure what to do with this space, and it slowly sort of emerged. But in housing the sarcophagi of those Nazis who were killed, the Nazi martyrs, supposedly, they gain a kind of quasi-mystical role. Mysticism is a key element of the Nazi regime. So architecture thus becomes an ideological construction of space. Architecture is there to help bind people into the regime, and indeed to the mystical side of the regime, that we should go and worship these heroes of the New Putsch. Again, there's some movie footage here which you can go and find online. They're quite interesting buildings to look at. Hagen, writing about this, says the Populaire, which is the large building on the western side of the square, remained the tallest structure and continued to occupy the most prominent position. Contemporary writers attributed this to restraint, a design not to overwhelm the Königsplatz existing scale and balance. Yet Hitler's later building projects, and indeed nearly every other aspect of his foreign and domestic policies, were not characterised by restraint. The point that Hagen is making here is that it hasn't quite worked out the architectural language of the regime at this stage, of the very early buildings, 33-34. That architectural style later becomes one of scale and dominance. So it's a trial run that we have here. It's symmetrical, and symmetry comes out of classical architectural tradition, it comes out of the sort of things that it wanted. But symmetry is along a road axis, so that the Führer building, which had a balcony to accommodate Hitler standing and addressing rallies, is off to one side of the square. It wasn't front and centre on the square. So they hadn't quite worked out the language. The regime at this point was still sufficiently fragile. They didn't want to risk outrage. They didn't want to risk common popular protest by overwhelming the existing landscape, particularly the classical buildings that are already on the other side. So we can see that the regime has not yet fully articulated, fully developed its architectural vocabulary at this stage. We turn now to Berlin and the things that were actually built in that city. Start with the Reichschancellery. Now, the old Chancellery building, Hitler judged as being insufficiently grand. He had Albert Speer and a pulpit so that Hitler could address the crowds, but Hitler compared it to the manufacturer, the offices of a soap manufacturer. Perfectly acceptable buildings, but not in keeping with the power of the man that they were accommodating. And he keys here into a Roman belief that buildings should match the autoritas, the power, the authority of the user. You should know that it's a powerful man working in that building simply by looking at the building and going, this is a dramatic piece of architecture. Therefore, Speer was commissioned to build a new Reichschancellery. He was commissioned the 10th of January 1938, and he was given a year to build this building. Now, for a medium-sized building project, a year is quite a long time, but this is a truly giant building project, and Speer was given an unlimited budget. And the rhetoric was about the fact that he delivered 2 days early. In actual fact, some of the internal fitting out still dragged on into the war, but essentially the building was broadly finished within a year. The hoovering up supplies of granite and marble from across Europe, estimated $1 billion cost in today's money to deliver this single building in a year. This was architecture to dominate. It was architecture to intimidate, particularly foreign visitors, but also domestic visitors, to come in and go, oh my lord, this is what this regime is about. This is what Hitler is about. This is impressive and frightening. Images of it don't really give you a sense of the scale. This was a very, very large building, but you can see the classical elements in there. You can see the rusticated pilasters running at the side of the building. You can see the simplified columns running at the central portico here. And again, the rhythms of the windows give echoes of classical design. It's stripped, it's simplified. If you take the Nazi guards away, it wouldn't look out of place. Except by scale, in any European capital at this time. But when you start looking in detail, you see the kind of design language coming out. So they have the Ehrenplatz, the Court of Honour, the main entrance, which is actually on the back of the building from the main street. And you have these figures that are classically inspired, that give you some sense of the majesty of the regime, as well as the imperial eagle gripping the swastika above the main entrance door. When you actually went into the building, you saw some truly dramatic architectural design. So here's the mosaic hall. Again, this is marble and granite of rose colour. A huge, huge space with intricate designs in the marble. The Marble Gallery, which is the gallery leading up to Hitler's office. Hitler's office is the one with the big gold star above it. Again, some echoes of the great galleries of country houses and palaces in Europe. And then you enter Hitler's personal office again. It's a massive space with a massive desk for a massive man. This is not architecture that's difficult to read. We don't need to know a lot to interpret how this space works. This is big architecture for a powerful, powerful man. Now, there was plenty of other architecture and designs which are happening at the time that don't look particularly out of place. The Tempelhof Airport building, which was for a time the largest covered structure on Earth, started around this point. It's a simplified neoclassical design, stripped down and simplified, but stonework over concrete. It's an unremarkable building in some ways, aside from its scale, which was huge. Again, if you look at it up close, you can see echoes of columns, you can see echoes of a simplified neoclassical design. The interior is the same. Again, you have things which are kind of like columns, or kind of reflecting Doric order, if in a very simplified way. If you look out at the Olympic Stadium, a building which still exists today, as does the Tempelhof Airport, the only difference from this view being that the swastika on the right column is now gone. You see a saucer-shaped building with columns that looks very much like it's inspired by classical designs. Indeed, the original designs were overruled by Speer for not being classical enough, and the original architects were required to do a redesign where they basically clad the building in granite to make it look more classical. Now, it's a severe classicism, but there's nothing inherently Nazi about the design. There's nothing which makes you think, after the war, we should knock this thing down because it's too closely associated with Nazi ideology. That stands in stark contrast to some of the things that were planned for Berlin had the regime been able to continue. These are the fantasy designs that have been come up with. This revolves primarily around Germania Welthauptstadt. If you go on the Berlin field course, you might have an opportunity to go and visit some of these sites, but Germania was to be the title, the new name for Berlin. Germania Welthauptstadt, capital of the world. And the Germania designs involved a 3-mile-long north-south parade route through central Berlin from a new railway station to an area just adjacent to the Reichstag. In undertaking the march along that 3-mile route, there was an entry point with a triumphal arch. A triumphal arch of a scale that the Arc de Triomphe in Paris could actually fit underneath. And at the opposite end from this triumphal arch, there was an enormous courtyard, a gigantic courtyard, which would include a new chancery building, as well as a building called the Volkshalle, the People's Hall. So here's a photograph of the model. The building to the bottom of the picture is the new train station. Then you see the triumphal arch and the parade route up to the domed building at the top, which was the Volkshalle. Again, just another shot of that model to give you some sense of the buildings that would line this parade route. This doesn't really give you a sense of the scale of just how huge these buildings would have been. Again, remember that this route, the bit that you can see here, is probably 1.5 miles long, so think about how big those buildings would have to be to line that sort of 1.5 miles, 2 mile route. Just a view of the Volkshalle through the triumphal archway. This is all about scale. And you can see in the front right corner of this image, you can see the Reichstag building, which was to be retained in the design. Speer had originally proposed knocking it down, but Hitler apparently liked the building so much that Speer was required to build it into the design. On the left-hand side of the square was the new Chancery building to replace the Neue Reichschancellery, which was to become the offices of another party elder. It wouldn't be magnificent enough for Hitler. Now, the Volkshalle, People's Hall, was to be 290 metres tall and sit on a solid granite base 315 metres by 315 metres. Again, think about the scale of that. That's huge. In this image, in the bottom right hand corner, you've got the Brandenburg Gate juxtaposed for scale. Now, the Brandenburg Gate is not a small building, and you can see how it's dwarfed by the People's Hall. And again, to think of scale and size, well, 203 metres tall is pretty tall. If you go to Berlin and you see the TV tower, well, this is, in terms of height, of a similar sort of scale to what the Volkshalle would have been. So it gives you some sense of just how dominant in the landscape this building would have been. Speer himself claimed that it was possible that had the Volkshalle been built, it would have had its own system of clouds forming in the interior based on the damp air breathed out by the huge crowd below. Hitler himself would have been dwarfed by this building standing talking to the assembled masses. Now the niche here in which the eagle sits is 50 metres tall. 50 metres again, that's a huge number when you stop and think about it. 180,000 people would be gathered. And on top of the dome was an oculus, a capstone if you like. And above the oculus was an eagle. And instead of the eagle gripping a swastika, which was the traditional thing that eagles would do in Nazi iconography, in this particular instance, the eagle is gripping in its talon the globe. This is not a difficult image to read. The imperial eagle dominates the whole world. Now, the oculus of this building was big. It was in fact 46 meters big. That's bigger than that building that we saw right at the start of the lecture, Hadrian's Pantheon. Just the capstone would be bigger than what had been the largest domed structure for centuries. Now, is this really ideology? Is this glorifying a regime, or is this just madness? You can see some of the groundworks have been started during the Second World War. So, photo from about 1945. Speer himself was quite, talking about the bombing of Berlin and lots of areas being destroyed, saying, "Well, it's great because that helps us clear the way to build Germania." This is not a regime that's particularly sane. And because the regime is not particularly sane, there is a question of what to do with the material remains. It leaves us with a problematic legacy. Can you read these buildings simply as being Nazism writ large? Are they so closely associated with the regime that we know to be evil, that they need to be got rid of? Or can you just remove the swastikas, and then they become just buildings? Because the kind of strict classicism that we see on things like Tempelhof Airport, that wasn't an architectural style that was unique to the fascists. It was an architectural style that Hitler liked, but that didn't mean that he was alone in that. And the thing about Germany in 1945 was it was broke, and it had a tremendous amount of bomb damage. So if you have a building that was intact and happened to have been one that was built by the Nazi regime, are you simply going to knock it down? Or are you just going to pull the swastikas off? Because a solid building is a solid building, no matter who built it, and if you're in need, make use of it. So what sort of things remain? Well, the Reichsministry, which was Speer's personal offices when he actually went on from being the chief architect of being a ministry of the earth, this building continues to exist. It was turned into the House of the Ministries under the DDR, the Deutsche Democratic Republic, former East Germany, and then after the German reunification in 1989, the building became the Ministry of Finance. But it's just a simplified classical building. The Nazi mosaic on one end of it was removed and replaced with a Soviet-era mosaic, but otherwise it's just a building. What else is left? Well, the Zeppelin Tribune building is partly there. The swastika was blown up immediately after the war. The wings of buildings had to be demolished in the 1960s because they were found to be structurally unsound. But it continued in use as basically a storage shed after the war. Tempelhof Airport and Olympic Stadium still very much there. The Munich Party Building and Führerbau, again, they're simple neoclassical buildings, not particularly remarkable. They still exist. One became a museum of classical statues, the other is a school for music and drama. And there are fragments of other things which you can find. The overground air raid shelter, which is found in the East German quarter of central Berlin. It became a storage unit for tropical fruit in the East German regime, nicknamed the Banana Bunker. After the wall came down, it became a techno club, and then it became a contemporary art collection by the Boros family, and a large new penthouse was built on top of it. But even this very pragmatic building, this concrete lump designed to resist bombs, has this neoclassical portico on the front of it. So the architectural language is still there, even in this most practical of buildings. You're not going to knock it down. No need. You see little fragments of the National Socialist ideologies. So the Strasse of the 17th of June was redesigned and reconfigured. The Statue of Victory was moved slightly to accommodate the building of Germania. You also see some of Albert Speer's designed streetlights are still knocking around in that area of town, but there's nothing here that absolutely screams Nazi. You really need to know what you're looking for to pick up on any of this design language. Other fragments that are still there, the heavy load-bearing body, which was a test unit designed to see whether Berlin's marshy ground could take the weight of Germania. It's basically a very large lump of concrete on top of some quite sophisticated measuring equipment. If it didn't sink too much, then the arches and Voltholler could be built. In fact, it sank a lot, and they couldn't have been built without basically drilling piles down virtually to the centre of the earth. What was destroyed? Well, the temples of honour were destroyed in Munich. You can see in the contemporary photograph that the bases of the temples are still there, but they've been allowed to be grown over rather while. They were blown up because they don't have any function beyond being a temple of honour. You couldn't really reuse them as anything, and they were too closely associated with being a shrine to the martyrs of the Munich Putsch, so they were blown up. The new Reichschancellery was very badly bomb damaged. It was ideologically problematic because of its close personal association with Hitler, so it was brought down. You can still see fragments of it if you go to Treptower Park and the Soviet War Memorial, because some of the marble that went into building the War Memorial was taken from the ruins of the Reichschancellery. A nice metaphor of taking it back a space that had been dominated by one ideology and using it for another ideology, repurposing the fallen enemy. Things that went well, the Lichtdom Arena to Nuremberg went, but the War Memorial survives, as does, as you saw from the earlier photographs, the arena next door. No one's going to pull down the War Memorial, however, because it's just a War Memorial. Now the Congress Hall, which we saw in the previous slide, survived, has been added to. It's had a documentation centre bolted to the top of it, designed by Ludwig. It was opened in 2001, and architecturally it's quite an interesting two fingers up at the regime, because it's very obviously a modernist architectural style, which is bolted to the top of the classical style that the Nazis preferred. So it's interesting the statement that this makes about the kind of space that Nuremberg's parade grounds represent. So we consider some issues of legacy. Should we try to erase history? Is the building itself ideologically problematic just because it was built by an ideologically problematic regime? Well, in some circumstances maybe it is. There's a risk of memorialising a regime which you don't really want to memorialise. So, for example, very little of the two bunkers that Hitler used under Berlin now remain. A lot of it's been covered over and sealed. If they were unsealed and turned into a tourist attraction, would they become a sort of neo-Nazi shrine? Is that something you want? On other levels, does knocking stuff down, wiping the slate clean, is that problematic because it risks losing our historical memory of an evil period that we shouldn't try to gloss over? We should make sure people never forget, and the buildings allow us to do that. Difficult set of issues to contemplate. So finally, to sum up, classical architecture has continued to have an influence on design down the century, but particularly useful where designers seek to give a historical veneer and grandeur to their designs. Nazi public building used architecture as a symbol of the regime's grandeur. Theatricality and display was central to the role of architecture as propaganda under the Nazi regime, but it took a while for the vocabulary of this to become fully established. The fancy designs of Berlin are one of the ultimate expressions of the regime's megalomania, and these buildings form a problematic legacy in untangling the rhetoric of the regime from material forms that resulted.